Welcome to the session on creating a trust environment with data protection. I'm Shenuka Jayalath, Manager Regulatory Group Legal and Regulatory Dialog ICTA PLC, and I'll be your moderator today. On the panel today, we have Mr. Jayantha Fernando, Chairman LK Domain Registry and Director Information and Communication Technology Agency of Sri Lanka. Ms. Sanduni Wickramasinghe, Assistant Manager Legal of Mobitel Private Limited. Mr. Ansgar, Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at Ernst & Young. Ms. Reina Young, Head of Privacy and Data Policy Engagement, APAC, Facebook. So the phrase, data is the new oil, is one of the most hacked phrases of the 21st century. This term often has a lot of negative connotations tied to it, when it shouldn't necessarily be so, because the processing of data can add a lot of value to human life. For example, it can be used to predict natural disasters, improve accuracy of medical tests, save energy, forecast harvests, and reduce costs for companies to a great extent. But to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So while data can be used to better human lives, it must also be used with the utmost caution, because misuse of the same can lead to severe repercussions from, if you take the number of data breaches over the past few years, you'll see how the breaches have led to fraud, identity theft, and a lot of costs to companies to remediate these breaches. And misuse of data has also affected the very fabric of society in predicting decisions and life-altering decisions almost. So it's important that organizations that use this data, use it and build trust by ensuring transparency in their use of the data, respect the rights of the data subjects, and ensure that adequate security measures are set in place when processing personal data. So if you look at the Sri Lankan context, hot news today is that Sri Lanka is looking at implementing a data protection law. So my first question today, I'd like to put it to Jayantha, who actually heads the drafting committee for this law. So Jayantha, you see the government of Sri Lanka looking at setting up a technology-based society. Data protection is an integral cog in the creation of such a technology-based society. So if you could just take us through how Sri Lanka has embarked on its data protection journey, give us a bit of a background to the drafting process, and maybe take us through the salient provisions of the draft law.
Yeah, thank you, Shenuka. A very good afternoon to all of you and the respective and my fellow panelists. Sorry, I would like to begin in the first instance by congratulating and thanking FITIS, the Federation of IT Industry in Sri Lanka, the umbrella organization representing a variety of stakeholders, for organizing such a valuable session on a variety of subjects, including on data protection, to commemorate the Internet Day. So whilst thanking them for that, I think it's a very good opportune moment to discuss new developments associated with a number of subjects. And I'm glad the organizers picked the subject of data protection also as a priority area. So to answer your question, Shenuka, data protection, privacy, and associated rights are becoming an integral part of a digitization in a digitized society. So with the knowledge-based society that we are experiencing, we have a lot of digitization efforts taking place in government, private sector, and across companies embarking on digital transformation. Today in the morning, we had an excellent plenary session where there was a discussion about the impact of the digitization on the capital market ecosystem in Sri Lanka, which has really harnessed the potential of the various stakeholders, resulting in a large number of new players, especially under 40 years, joining the capital market ecosystem and joining the equity, buying stocks, selling stocks, and trading in the Colombo Stock Exchange in a manner which was hitherto not available. So in that ecosystem, also one of the challenges faced was, well, many young players who want to enter the market are joining the digital application process online, doing their verification of their identity online through the integrated solution provided by the National Identity Office, and obtaining accounts through which they are trading. So if you look at that cycle, Shenuka and my fellow panelists, we have an interesting challenge. Where is the data collected? Who is the data owner and custodian of that data? And where will that data of nearly more than 12,200 new customers who have entered the capital market ecosystem digitally, where will their data be hosted? So these are interesting dimensions that need to be addressed. And in that context, only that due to the demand of digital services across government, private sector, banking, telco, and now the capital market ecosystem growing rapidly, it was felt important that data protection law was a missing piece all this while, that it needed to be addressed, and that it was imperative to get this done fast with the implementation strategy. Now, I'll come to the implementation strategy later on during the discussion if we have time. But what I want to emphasize is that given the importance of digitization across all the sectors, this subject became of significant importance. And then the relevant ministry responsible for the subject of digital transformation embarked on an initiative to kick start the data protection law drafting process. So when I was asked to lead the process at that time, we were given a choice. Either we could only have government stakeholders, or we could bring government, private sector, and a variety of other stakeholders.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. So sorry for that interruption. I think I was getting a call. That's one of the problems in the modern age of doing all this online. So when we were asked to lead the drafting process, we were given much choice as to whether we should have governmental stakeholders alone. That traditionally happens in a legal drafting process related to the legislative drafting in Sri Lanka, where only a pure governmental group gets together representing the various regulatory branches like Central Bank, SEC, and a few other entities like the Telecom Regulatory Commission. So that would be the normal approach that would be taken in drafting a law like this. However, given the fact that we were empowered with an approach that would result in a quality product, we decided to follow a different approach, where we got the legal draftsman's department through the Ministry of Justice, the Central Bank representing one of the key regulators as a stakeholder, and then brought on board a very unique group of private sector stakeholders who are engaged in the practice of data protection. So I'm happy to say that we had a public-private partnership in the process of drafting the legislation, and I'm happy to say that both Shenuka and Sanduni represent that private sector, a strong private sector background that was involved in the drafting process that led to the refined version of the data protection bill we have at present. So Having said that, in terms of background, Shenuka, what I want to say is that our constitutional framework in Article 14A that recognizes a fundamental right to the right to information embeds a provision where privacy is an exemption. And the Right to Information Act in Section 5 provides a framework where the privacy or the protection of personal information or violation thereof could be an exemption in the grant or release of information from a public authority. So based on that foundation, our drafting committee embarked on a journey to formulate a data protection framework that was built on a couple of international best practices. So we looked at the OECD privacy guidelines, the APEC privacy framework, the Council of Europe Data Protection Convention, and also the GDPR, and also the legislative frameworks of UK, Singapore, Australia, Mauritius, including that of California, and the draft Indian bill. Now, having looked at all these models, we felt we could bring about a proper structure that could take care of the rights of data subjects and impose obligations on controllers and processors with a fine sense of balance. So that is what was done, and the drafting process started with us making an initial framework available for public comment, and thereafter we saw the framework being discussed in several stakeholder forums. In fact, we had 7 of them, and that resulted in the legal draftsman having the ability to get feedback from stakeholders while we were finalizing the bill. The finalized bill was thereafter submitted to cabinet for the first round, and then last year we went through a process of modification based on stakeholder comment, and we had a large, well-attended session with the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, mainly for the junior bar, which was conducted on the 21st of February last year. And the Attorney General, Minister of Justice gave exhaustive comments. And towards October, the drafting committee, through our independent review panel, responded to the Ministry of Justice Attorney General's observations, and we had a further refined version in December. And now through February, March, we have a revised final draft, which has again been subject to stakeholder review. And I am told the good news is that latter part of this week, the legal draftsman will be releasing the final version of the draft bill to our line ministry for consideration and submission to cabinet. Now, in closing, what I want to emphasize, Shenuka, is that several obligations have been imposed through the legislation on entities, government, private sector entities who collect and process personal data, who are known as controllers and processors, and a whole new set of rights have been given to citizens under this legislation. So part 1, part 2, part 3 would cover, and I know you and Sanduni, especially, who are heavily involved in this process, will give inputs later on today on the various components. But I just want to emphasize 2 important facets in this bill that is considered unique. We have a data protection, we have a mechanism through which controllers would be able to, would be compelled to do a data protection management program. We have a mechanism whereby the Data Protection Authority can give directives to controllers and processors to comply with the provisions of the law if they have deviated from it. And then we have a mechanism to impose fines and penalties if the directives of the Data Protection Authorities are not complied with. But what is important is that there is an appeals process, and the rules of natural justice have to be followed in conducting inquiries by the Data Protection Authority. Finally, we have in our law a unique provision governing automated decision making. So in a process where a controller is embarked on an activity or a decision making activity based solely on automated processing, the data subject would have a right to request a review of that decision making process. So the AI aspect has been addressed in a kind of a novel way in our bill, and then we have a provision defining a cross-border flow of data in the data protection bill, which will be found in the new section 26, where there are parameters under which hosting data in the cloud will be possible. So these are some of the key features of the bill. I will not go into too much of detail. I think I have already said a lot within that short time frame. So this is a journey background and some of the key features of the law. And I think this is just a stage setter for us today. And I'm sure FITIS would do a much more detailed one-day event on the data protection subject once the final version of the bill is available with the translated versions in the latter part of May this year. Thank you, Shenuka.
Thanks a lot, Jayantha, for that snapshot view of the process and the bill itself. Just taking something that you said on how the younger generation, they are more interested in using online methods. So in the creation of a technology-based society, it's imperative that digital literacy is given prominence. So flowing from that, let's taking that into consideration, I'd like to raise the next question to answer. So on digital literacy, how is digital literacy a key component of a technology-based society? I understand you've done a lot of work in this area, so maybe you could elaborate.
So yes, thank you very much for this question, and also for the invitation to speak on this panel. So yes, as part of my work, I've been part of a research project with the universities of Nottingham, Oxford, and Edinburgh, where we were looking at really the question about how do people understand the online services such as recommender systems, search engines, and those kinds of algorithmically driven, data driven kinds of services that we are engaging with so much. And one of the things that really came out of our engagements with stakeholders, with particularly with young people, but also from various kind of age groups, was that people want to learn not just the, is it taking my this kind of data from me, but they also want to understand a bit more about what actually is this algorithm doing with the kind of data. Not just is it taking this data, but why does it do this? Some basic understandings around how do algorithms operate, what is the kinds of business model behind these systems, like when I go to this a certain website, why does it ask for certain types of data that potentially as a user are not immediately obvious to me, why that is going to be relevant for the interactions that I'm currently doing with this. For instance, when we were talking with young people, what we were hearing, and this was in the context of the UK, but it applies to many countries, I believe, is the young people were complaining in a sense that at school, the digital literacy kind of courses they were getting were teaching them every year more or less the same thing about don't do this online, don't share these kinds of data online, how to keep yourself safe online, so to speak, but they were never getting information about how do these systems actually operate. How is it that I visited this one site online and then I went to another one and somehow I'm now getting recommendations that are related to the previous site that I visited? Why is it that if my younger brother used this service for a bit and then I come back to it, suddenly all of the recommendations are messed up and I'm getting things that I didn't really want to have? Those kinds of questions. They want to have a better understanding about the underlying processes. And very importantly, they also want the kind of literacy training that they're getting to evolve with the way in which they actually use the internet changes as they grow. And so really one of the core points I would say around the digital literacy question is really it's provide everybody with a certain baseline understanding of what are the core principles, how data-driven systems actually operate, just so that you can have a similar sense of understanding how things work as you do with other machines. I don't need to know the details of how a car engine works, but I do want to have a basic sense of how a car operates when I get into it, just so that I feel comfortable with what I'm doing. And so that's really a core kind of mission that I think the government needs to be supporting, and companies as well need to be engaging with to provide, you know, in addition to your terms and conditions, in addition to your privacy settings, a basic, and this is how our system operates, so that you can get a sense of what it is that you're engaging with.
Thanks, Ansgar. So in terms of building a better understanding of the concepts, that definitely would help the younger generation, and it will also help even companies to implement their programs, and in general the public, for them to have a better understanding of privacy or data protection as it may. So flowing from that, Sanduni, the next question I want to raise is the terms data privacy, data protection, and data security. They're often used interchangeably. So would you be able to just take us through the nuances of the terminology and touch on how the interplay between each of these concepts is essential for a smooth implementation of an organization's privacy program in a way that enhances consumer trust?
Yeah. Thanks, Shenuka. Thank you, Shenuka, and for this opportunity. Now, actually, it's a very timely question, because sometimes, as you already pointed out, we do tend to use these terms interchangeably. So one thing I like to highlight, clarify at the outset is that although they're related, they're not identical. So the notion of privacy depends on the context. It differs from one person to the other. It depends on from one situation to the other. But it essentially speaks of you having control over your personal data in terms of how they are disclosed and in what way they're used. Data security, on the other hand, is basically ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility to the data. So basically, safeguarding your data from external threats, from being hacked or leaked or otherwise breached. And data protection principles, whereas data security is also enumerated in that umbrella term, is the method how one business can process personal data whilst ensuring principles of legitimacy, fairness, proportionality, transparency within its own operations. So together, data security and data protection achieve the end, what we understand as privacy. So you cannot achieve true sense of information privacy without having either of these two elements. So in your question about how this interplays with an organization's privacy program, what I like to clarify here is that the two aspects of data protection and data security, the privacy management program basically caters into two objectives. One is to manage obligations towards the regulator, and the other is to manage their obligations towards the customers. And where consumer trust is concerned, this directly relates to the relationship an organization would have with its customers as opposed to the regulator. And in building that trust, one of the two, I think, important aspects is creating that trust, building that trust, as well as retaining that trust in a sustainable manner. And because after all, end of the day, like I said, customers have a different sense or different notion of what is private and what privacy means to each of them. And the regulator might also come into the picture and sort of introduce what privacy means in different contexts. So to navigate all this, it's important that an organization understands its obligations vis-a-vis data protection principles and data security principles, and navigate these expectations of the customers and regulators in a very meaningful way. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Sanduni. So creating, building, and retaining consumer trust and balancing the regulatory requirements on the other hand, that's a key takeaway, and it's good because it paves way for the next question to Reina, who works at Facebook. So Facebook is a company which processes a large quantity of personal data, and it has a marked global presence. So how does such a large organization comply with the different data protection laws around the world, and what internal policies and technical measures has it put in place to enhance consumer trust? So how does it, in other words, balance the regulatory requirements of multiple jurisdictions and also deal with the trust aspect for its consumers? So Reina, over to you.
Thank you, Shenuka, and thank you. I'd like to thank you, Fetis, for this opportunity for me to participate in this panel. For Facebook, we comply with all applicable laws and regulations. And I want to address a point about, because this panel is about trust, building trust with consumer, building trust with data protection. Data privacy is an issue that affects everyone. And it's important that we get it right. Unless we build trust around data online, innovation that can benefit society, free data will fail to achieve its full potential. But we all know that my previous, before I joined Facebook, I was working as a data protection authority, as a regulator. So I know that the road to building like culture of privacy is it doesn't change, it doesn't achieve overnight. And that's why I think event like today that brings together different stakeholders at the cutting edge of data is very important step forward for Sri Lanka, for different stakeholders to work together to create this culture. So at Facebook, we actually every day billions of people around the world use our products to make their lives richer and to help the organizations thrive. So it makes it very especially important that people who use our platform can trust that their information is protected. But we are also seeing that people, they don't just look at the data handling practices to determine if they trust us. We make decisions on content moderation every day. So everyday platforms like ours, we have to make trade-offs on important social values like between freedom of expression and safety, privacy and law enforcement, and between creating open systems and locking down data. And there's rarely a clear right answer. Often it's important that decisions are made in a way that people feel it's legitimate and which they can trust. So that's why when we are thinking about, and a lot of the decisions we make touch on fundamental values like democratic values. And we don't think private companies like ours should make so many decisions alone. And that's why our company has called for globally consistent internet regulations. In 4 areas, there are elections, harmful content, privacy, and data portability. And these are problems that need to be fixed and that affect the entire industry as a whole. If we don't create standards or regulation that people feel are legitimate, they won't trust the institutions or the technology. And oftentimes new technology, the adoption of new technology is very much dependent on people's trust in the technology. And that's why we call for effective privacy and data protection regulations around the world so that all the players, you have some standard, a common baseline or common standards to abide by. It actually enhances users' trust in the entire data ecosystem and in the technology, and it will actually encourage adoption of new technology. But of course, we won't agree with every proposal regulation, especially for regulation that can have unintended consequences. So, for example, we know from a lot of research that cross-border data flows have transformed the way the world operates, and it benefits consumers and businesses across the board. And in this digital world, and the COVID has highlighted the importance of cross-border data flow. And a lot of researchers around the world, they rely on cross-border data flow to find solutions, find vaccine, to fight the COVID. So it highlights the importance of cross-border data flow. And actually cross-border data flow, it allows consumers have more information, connectivity and choices, and businesses can leverage data flows to enter new markets and operate at low cost, innovate, and also consolidate research and development. And this is even more urgent in the wake of the pandemic, as businesses use digital and data tools to reach consumers online is now central to how many countries, to a lot of countries when they are trying to emerge from the pandemic. So our view is that regulatory requirements like localization not only restrict people's ability to connect to global digital services, but also impact on local digital economy. That's why Facebook, we call for effective privacy and data protection as part of a globally harmonized framework. If you look at not just Facebook, but a Sri Lanka business, a startup, if you want to grow your business and tap into the online market or your consumer base globally, you need to reach out to, you need to rely on cross-border data flow. And for these businesses to operate in different jurisdictions is actually quite challenging to need to comply with data protection laws. And that's why we call for globally harmonized framework, so that it actually help businesses in terms of their compliance, and it actually gives users peace of mind when they know that whenever the data is being transferred or whenever the data goes, they will have the same protection. Maybe I'll now turn to your second part of the question regarding our internal policies. I think it's very important that when we look at data protection and data privacy management framework, the tone, they have this term like tone from the top. So our founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, said that one of the main goals for next decade for Facebook is to build stronger privacy protections for everyone on Facebook. So getting data privacy and security right is fundamental to our business. And protecting privacy and security of people's data is fundamental to our business works, and it's everyone's responsibility at Facebook. It's baseline of everything we do. So we invest heavily in systems and processes to uphold this commitment. Our business model is that we rely on ad revenue to support the free services to our users, but we don't sell users' data, and it will never do. And we work with a lot of third-party partners who help us provide and improve our products, or who use Facebook tools to grow the business, which makes it possible to operate our companies and provide free services to people around the world. But we impose strict restrictions on how our partners can use and disclose the data we provide. And another thing I want to highlight is we design privacy into our products. To put it simply, for new and updated products or features that store, process, or share user data, they must go through a privacy review before they launch. And in many cases, even before the product or the feature is even built. Let me talk about privacy review. We had a version of privacy review process for many years, but over the past year, we've made even stronger by using a more holistic approach with more extensive technical validation and more in-depth internal and external consultations. And it's not just about making a good decision, but also about documentation and implementation, and bringing the team along and making the product teams even more privacy aware and leading to better future decisions. And as part of our revamped privacy review process for new products and updates, we look even more closely at how we use data, how we assess risks and put safeguards in place to address them. This process has already led to significant industry-leading innovations and improvements across our company on our processes, products, and engineering teams over the past 12 months. For example, when we go through a range of privacy considerations during the course of privacy review, we look at transparency and control, because we understand that for a lot of data protection law, transparency and control is actually foundational for under a lot of data protection law, which is about communicating your product behavior, your data practices proactively, clearly and honestly, and giving people control over the data with appropriate tools and features. And we learned that different people have different expectation of privacy, even like different regions. People in US, EU, and even in APAC may have different expectations on privacy. And that's why we work with external experts, academics in different regions, and we consult with them to understand, and policymakers and regulators to understand the regional different expectation on privacy, and build that into the tools and controls that we build to empower people to take control of their control of their privacy. So for example, we have tools that allow our users to choose the audience that they want to share the post with. They can either choose to share the post publicly or with just their friends, or they can even share the post with just themselves. And people can do it through a tool called Audience Selector. And then people can also want to use private messaging to connect with their old friends. Another tool that we build people use our service, they will see ads. And we know that people, they oftentimes we hear people and privacy stakeholders told us that they want to understand how our ad system works. And that's why we build a tool called Ad Preference. You can manage the information that we use to show you ads. And for transparency, we actually, we have this tool called Why Am I Seeing This Ad? When you see an ad on your right-hand corner, you will see 3 dots, and you can click on that, and you will put it there. That's a toolbar, put it down, and you will see you will have information tell you why you will see this particular ad. It may be that you have clicked a similar subject matter in the past. So this is how we understand that people want to know more how our system works, and how that's why we build this tool to let people understand how our system works, and they can actually use the ad preference tools to actually control what kind of data we can use to personalize the experience on our platform. So in the end, I think our people's expectation of privacy is very much tied to people's personal preferences. And we know that that expectation is changing all the time as technology continues to develop. And we strive to adapt alongside these developments, and the process is an ongoing and improvement. And for us, we have a responsibility to people who rely on our products and services to use personal data to share with us in a way which is transparent, legitimate, and empowers them to have control. It is also a business imperative. If people do not trust us, our business will not be successful. So thank you.
Thanks, Reina. So while we hold the thought of how trust is imperative for businesses to flourish and continue and to build consumer trust, I'm just going to move on quickly to Ansgar again. We earlier spoke about, I think Jayantha mentioned that the proposed bill in Sri Lanka has a provision on ADM, that is automated individual decision making. So in your experience, as more and more data is collected, analyzed, and processed, what lessons can Sri Lanka take as institutions move more into automated decision making? Because it's not something that is large, it's not used as much as it is in the West, automated individual decision making, but companies are moving more and more into AI and looking to heavily rely on these technologies. What lessons can we take as a developing nation from these from your experience?
Yes, thank you. So obviously, data-driven technologies, algorithmic decision-making, etc., they have a strong promise with them to be able to provide people with a more tailored set of decisions and services that are more specifically matching with the kind of requirements that a particular individual has. There's a potential that using live data flows, that there is the ability to make sure that the services are more up to date with the most recent situations. However, all of these require that the data has the appropriate quality that is needed. So the quality of the data, understanding the provenance of the data, where does it come from? Are we accessing the most appropriate data for the particular kind of uses, as opposed to simply the easiest to get kind of data set, is a very important aspect. If we look at cases where there have been large concerns, where people have ended up not getting the kinds of services that they needed, that they were having services denied because potentially they were incorrectly being assessed. Often this had to do with the quality of data, for instance, credit allocation and those kinds of services have run into difficulties when data from different individuals became mixed up. People had a similar kind of name as somebody who potentially ran into difficulties with the law. Their data sets got intermixed, and then they ended up being denied access to credit, etc. These are important issues that need to be taken into consideration. Also very important, and this clearly connects directly to the provision in your data law around the ability to demand a reassessment of a decision, is to realize no matter how good these technologies are made, no technology is perfect. Also, if we're relying on things like machine learning, these are inherently probabilistic systems. They will learn from the pattern in data to try to identify which kinds of data sets most likely predict something about inferences about what the next best decision should be. However, all of these things are probabilistic. That means there will always be cases for which the decision is not the optimal one. So there needs to be mechanisms in place in order to be able to address those cases where the system hasn't performed correctly. That means two things. On the one hand, the person about whom a decision is being made, the person who will be impacted by the decision, must be aware of where they can go to raise an issue, to notify that they believe a mistake has been made. On the other hand, it also means that the frontline staff, the people who are part of the organization, be it government, be it corporate, that are interacting with the citizens who are being impacted, they need to have sufficient understanding of how this technology operates, of how these decisions were made, so that they can engage in correct communication, so that they can correctly interpret the information that the algorithm is generating, and so that they will be able to identify where a particular problem cause can come from. So really what we're talking about here is a certain level of transparency, a certain level of appropriate explainability. You do not need to explain all of the ins and outs of the specifics of the algorithm, but you do need to be able to explain the core concept of what it is that the organization is actually trying to achieve with this algorithm, why this particular kinds of data is considered to be relevant for this kinds of decision making, and how it is that you are maintaining the quality of the data. If we also think about issues such as bias and discriminatory impacts that have arisen from certain types of algorithmic decision making, these often find their source in insufficient quality of the data, insufficient understanding also of the variety of the types of people who are going to be impacted by this, that not everybody is of the same type, how many different types of subgroups with particular kinds of concerns do you actually have? And potentially for certain kind of application, they might not fall into your classic kind of divisions of wealth category, gender category, race category, or something like that. They might be certain different types of combinations of these as appropriate to the type of application. So really thinking through, what do the stakeholders, the impacted parties, what do they look like? Do we need to do an assessment on different one of these to make sure that even if the system is 90% correct, it isn't actually 100% incorrect for this minority group who just happen to be less than 10% of the total stakeholder set. So these are some of the core issues that need to be considered when using these technologies, but it is important to take a realistic perspective to these. Just because the system isn't absolutely perfect doesn't mean that it isn't an improvement over the current way of doing things when it was not using this kind of algorithmic approach. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ansgar, for that. Very, very advanced thoughts indeed on AI and what's in it for the future. So I'm just going to stop my round of questions for a moment and take up a couple of questions that have been raised by the audience. I think there are a couple of queries on the terminology that I've used on what exactly the scope of the act is. So maybe I could ask Sanduni to just take us through the different actors who play a part in the data protection bill, and also maybe touch on what personally identifiable information is, because the act, as you know, it touches on PII and not on any other type of data. So maybe you could just do a very quick wrap up of those the terms, and also maybe this next one, maybe Jayantha could also add on, talk about the cross-border data flows and allowing PII to be hosted outside of Sri Lanka, what the position of the law would be with regard to that. Maybe Jayantha could also add on once Sanduni just takes us through.
Thanks, Shenuka. In terms of how the proposed bill defines personal data, is in line with the international accepted norms, and it relates to someone who's already identified, or a human being who can be identified with reference to certain unique identifiers. So it could be their name, their address, their NIC number, or anything that unique to their physiological or psychological, cultural, or racial or any other identity. So the one thing to emphasize here is the bill does not relates or is not concerned with information that relates to legal persons, that is to say, information relating to companies. So the bill is drafted to cover only the aspects of data that relates to living human beings, basically, living and deceased human beings. And so in doing so, they recognize certain parties such as controllers. These are the entities who decides on the intention and the purposes and the means of processing those data subjects' personal data. So they decide what data to collect, what ends that this data is going to be used, and they may engage the services of an entity called processors. So these are people who are not within the same organization as the controller, but something like an outsourced entity or another third party who performs certain processing activities strictly on the instructions that ensue from the controller. And so I think Jayantha basically covers the salient aspects of this law, where we recognizes certain statutory rights under this bill, and also how it recognizes certain data processing principles, starting from lawfulness to data retention, to purpose specification and purpose limitation, ensuring security, and most importantly, the principal aspects of transparency and accountability. And in addition to that, of course, there is this redress mechanism given where you can apply to courts to enforce your rights. and it's a very novel law in itself. And if I may just briefly take you through the aspects of transborder data flow, aspects covered by the law, the only localization requirement that is imposed is only on government entities. That is to say, ministries, government departments. However, there is a certain flexibility given where the Data Protection Authority, which is going to be established in the future, may, with the concurrence of the applicable regulator or the supervisory body, may determine certain aspects of data that can be stored outside of Sri Lanka despite this prima facie localization requirement. So this only applies to government entities. Otherwise, it follows the same procedure which you would find in other international instruments such as the GDPR, where the minister is empowered to decide certain jurisdictions in the adequacy decision-making process, and also recognition of other legal instruments similar to the SCCs or the BCR, or what we call standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, for example. So all this, the flexibility is given, and the once the authority is set up, you will find all these the requisite regulations, rules, and guidelines coming into place to to clarify the framework even further.
Yeah. So Shenuka, thanks, Sanduni. So now I think Sanduni covered some aspects of cross-border data flow. So Shenuka, if I am to just add to what Sanduni just mentioned, quite rightly, section 26 of the revised bill is what takes care of the subject of cross-border data flow. We have tried to bring in a kind of a moderate policy approach, which I would, if I may say so, where the restrictions are placed on data collected pursuant to a written law governing a public authority. So, for example, the Motor Traffic Department, Immigration Department, the Identity Card Department, for example, including the Registrar General that collects our birth and death information, are doing so pursuant to their respective governing laws. Those entities are compelled under the law to host their data within the boundaries of Sri Lanka. And of course, as quite rightly mentioned by Sanduni, we have a white listing process where, let's say, the regulatory authority, our data protection authority, can consult, let's say, with the central bank, SCC, or some similar authority to classify data sets that can be hosted in those whitelisted countries. But the only important point I want to add here is that whatever approach, I mean, when it comes to the private sector entities that are not covered under those two elements that I described or Sanduni described earlier, the private sector entities that collect data are free to host their data outside Sri Lanka, but they are compelled under the law to fulfill the obligations in terms of the key data protection principles, as well as the right of data subjects embedded in the data protection law in part 1 and part 2, and the risk impact assessment and the risk management aspects covered in the bill are required to be followed by entities that host data outside the country. That is what I thought I'll add to what Sanduni just mentioned. Thank you, Shenuka.
Okay, thanks, Jayantha. So we have another 2 minutes remaining. So maybe this last question, Reina and Ansgar, as people who are at the helm, Reina as a person at the helm of a company, at the helm of technological advancements, and Ansgar as a professional in that area. There's a question from the audience which says, how can a good balance be reached between personal data protection and technological advancement? can both ideas coexist? So maybe in the next 2 minutes, if you could both share your thoughts.
I think that's an excellent question. And we see that actually, if you look at GDPR, actually, I think one of its objectives is definitely for data protection, but at the same time, it also wants to encourage like how can it also to encourage innovation. So I think it's very important in data protection law, and I think there's a lot of literature about like data protection. Privacy is not an absolute right. There are other like public interests or other competing like public policy interests that when the government, they're looking at data protection law, they need to balance that. So I think from our vintage point, we think GDPR has struck quite a good balance in that regard, and I think this is something, a directionally we think we think governments are considering data protection law. GDPR is a very good like reference point because it has this benefit of both serving both objectives like data protection, but at the same time also encourages innovation.
And so just to add to that, I think, yes, data protection law can be seen as potentially making life a bit more difficult for if you want to continue to do the types of data analytics in the way that it has been done. But it can also be a motivator for new innovation. And for instance, in this case, I'm thinking about other ways of doing data analytics. There is a lot of very interesting work happening now on the use of homomorphic encryption, for instance, so that you can actually do data processing on the data while it is still encrypted, which means that the outside parties will not be able to actually do get access to the privacy part of the private data. There's interesting work happening on federated learning for machine learning systems, which means you do not need to actually transfer all of the data from your own device to a central database. You can maintain the data distributed on your own device, and the machine learning actually is distributed to those devices. So in a sense, you can think of this as, instead of bringing the data to where the question is being posed and the analysis being done, you're transferring the question to the device where the data is being held, so that the data can be maintained in a private encapsulated space in your own device. So there are quite a number of different ways of thinking about the problem of data analytics, of reconceptualizing actually the way in which we handle the data that can be privacy protecting, and with that can potentially also help with the security aspect around the data. If we reduce the existence of centralized data sets, then we also remove the big targets for cybersecurity hacks, the singular point of failure for which a lot of this kind of valuable data can be accessed. So data privacy law, I believe, is not a hinder to innovation, rather it is a challenge, and it gives a certain direction in which the innovation can be going. Similar to what we've seen in other types of technology spaces, introduction of environmental legislation has led to improved efficiency on car engines. It has led to various other kinds of improvements in the way in which we're doing innovation. The same is true when it comes to data and data privacy.
Thanks, Ansgar, for that, and Reina. So reconceptualizing the way we process data, I think that's a key take from the last question. I think we are all out of time. So thank you everyone for joining. We hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you to all our panelists and to FITIS for organizing this session. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.